So our first presentation for the afternoon is going to be called Public Leadership and Decolonization, and it is going to be given to us by Dr. Matthew Wildcat. Dr. Wildcat is the Director of Indigenous Governance and Partnership and an Assistant Professor of Native Studies at the University of Alberta. So he will be calling in from the mountainous region, which is lovely. He is a member of the Ermineskin Cree Nation and grew up on reserve. Additionally, Dr. Wildcat is the co-director of the Prairie Relationality Network. He was previously the communications director of Masquatchee's Education Schools Commission that resulted in the creation of a unified school system for the 4 nations of Masquatchees. And finally, Dr. Wildcat is the founder of the Relational Governance Project that explores how multiple First Nations co-govern service delivery organizations. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Matthew Wildcat.
Great. Thanks, Benny. Appreciate the introduction. So I'm here with you from Banff, Treaty 7 territory. It's the land of the Nakota Sioux, but also the Blackfoot. And I know some of my ancestors, the Cree, were in this area as well. The talk I want to give today is focused on public leadership and decolonization. And it's part of kind of working towards a course that I'm hoping to offer in a master's in sustainability a master's in sustainability program being built up at the University of Alberta. And so here, these are kind of like some of the opening thoughts I have in kind of in service of that direction. So, I think in order to get a sense of what decolonization looks like, we kind of have to start with what colonialism is in the present, right? Like that has to be the foundation of if we don't have an understanding of what we're working from, then it's hard to think through what decolonization is going to look like, right? And so, in the context that we live in Canada, part of what is colonization is that we live in a settler colonial context, right? And there's all sorts of theories now and ways of describing what settler colonialism is. But for me, I think the easiest way to understand why we live in a settler colonial society is that, when newcomers came to this land, rather than join Indigenous societies, people brought their own legal, political, and economic systems with them. And I think most importantly, actively worked to displace Indigenous economic, legal, and political systems, right? So, in all of this, of course, land is a central and important component. So, where I'm from on the prairies, I think then the way in which we think through decolonization is through, we have to replace this colonial relationship that we have, this hierarchy that's been created between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples from Indigenous systems being pushed out by the systems of newcomers, is that we have to replace that with a treaty relationship, right? And so for Indigenous peoples on the prairies, this is often founded on the number treaties. But of course, Indigenous peoples all across Canada have various ways of describing what a decolonized relationship would look like, right? Like, and you have the Gaswenta, the Churo Wampum out in that part of the world. And so, there's all sorts of ways in which I think Indigenous peoples have articulated what a just relationship looks like. And so in particular for me, one of those ways is also this Cree term called Wetaskiwin. And so there's actually a town named Wetaskiwin. I went to high school there. It was right by Ermineskin Reserve where I grew up. But this idea of Wetaskiwin means learning how to live on the land together. And it's this, the thinking there is like, okay, what does it mean for two separate peoples to be able to share a space with each other, right? So, I think, one of the other things I want to mention with decolonization just briefly is that, one of I think the more famous pieces of scholarship on decolonization is this article, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And I think the main point of that article is that, decolonization isn't just going to involve like creating ways of talking about equity and social justice, but there's like a material aspect too, right? And it's thinking about how you give land back, the return of land, and I think necessarily involving those changing of these various like economic, political, legal systems. And so, probably most people are familiar with the land back movement in some sort of way. And for today, I want to bracket off this question of land back. Like there's all sorts of immediate things that can be done with that movement, but it's also a very hard process to manage in a global world. And so I want to focus on here decolonization from the standpoint of like, what are some short-term what are the short-term practices that leaders need to like public leaders need to take in our present world in order to help us move us towards these kind of, I think, these longer term goals of living in a, moving from living in a colonial society to living in a, a society founded on treaty, or a society where we live on the land together right? So, okay. So for me, a big part of this, I think, is, we're going to translate these ideals we have around decolonization in the present. There's these kind of two interrelated activities. So, one, obviously, I think Indigenous peoples need to be afforded autonomous spaces. It sounds like this conference that you're having is kind of one of those examples of, giving Indigenous people control over how the conference is going to work. And of course, those need to just proliferate in all sorts of different ways. But the other is that there's going to have to be some sort of, interface between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in terms of how we make decisions together, right? And so, this, I would call this interface, it's these, in a legal sense, people call it like intersocietal laws, right? And so, I'll just call it intersocietal norms. And so we have to build out our intersocietal norms. And obviously we have all sorts of intersocietal norms right now, but they tend to be highly colonial, right? That like the way in which we have to work out decisions day to day between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, it is still overly tilted, incredibly so, in favor of colonial society. So those intersocietal norms have to become about this, like this Cree term of Wetaskiwin, of like, okay, how do we build out intersocietal norms where we learn to live on the land together well? So I think here there is something actually quite useful to say about what I'll call these like focal documents. They have these kind of gravitational pulls. So, one, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but two, also that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. So with the UN DRIP, Indigenous peoples, let's look at the main article, Article 3, right? It's Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development, right? And so this is a legal instrument within the global sphere that was pushed through by the international Indigenous rights movement. It took them decades, from the 1970s up until 2007 or 2008. I forget exactly when it was passed, but it's also a complex claim, because it's not a claim of secession, right? It's not a claim that Indigenous peoples are just going to form their own states and then remake the kind of like the maps and like the nation state boundaries of the world, but it's a claim to political distinctiveness and autonomy in relation to nation states, right? And so it's a hard claim to think about. So one of the ways where we can like kind of build up our thinking about it is this related notion of free, prior, and informed consent. So prior to development, Indigenous peoples must have free, prior, and informed consent over development projects that take place on our lands. One of the things that irks me about this in a public discourse way is that it often wrongly gets construed as a veto power, right? It's like, oh, Indigenous peoples have a right to say yes or no to all projects. And the reason why I don't like when people try to funnel that discussion into, oh, should Indigenous peoples have a veto power or not, is because it gets painted in such a way where obviously one side should just not be able to like railroad the other side. I think that's exactly what Indigenous peoples are, of course, asking. But it instead, I think what Indigenous peoples are asking for in this discussion on free, prior, and informed consent is this, again, this idea of Wetaskiwin. Okay, how do we learn to live on the land together, right? And that, of course, is a will require us to build out a whole bunch of skills around these intersocietal norms, because we can't just then assess any sort of development project on its own merits. It also has this bigger component of okay, what are the norms through which we decide things together, right? What are these intersocietal norms? How do we live on the land together? And really with the free, prior, and informed consent, that's what's being asked, right? Is, okay, we have to build out all these norms of like thinking through how is it that Indigenous peoples are given primacy over, all of these questions and brought in all these substantive ways. So, okay, I'm running out of time here. I'm gonna try to squeeze this in. So I just want to really briefly, this is from an article that was recently published, I co-authored, and I just want to bring these two quotes out just to kind of illustrate this, like trying to get at this thinking of like, okay, what does like good relationships look like, right? So this is from Northern Canada during the Berger inquiry, which is an inquiry over a building of a pipeline. So Philip Blake, if our Indian nation is being destroyed so that the poor people of the world might get a chance to share the world's riches, then as Indian people, I'm sure we would seriously consider giving up our resources. This other quote is from a woman in Northern Australia in the wake of the Mabo decision. She's again talking about land here. She says, I mean, we're not going to say you can't come in here, you can't go fishing or anything like that, And if you said probably this major mineral deposit here, if it's the last major mineral deposit on Earth, on our lands, we'd probably say, I guess, yeah, go ahead and dig it up if you really need it, right? And I think what's being illustrated here is not like is a complex way of thinking about something like development, right? Is like, okay, we're thinking about what is good along various registers. But for Indigenous peoples, those registers aren't going to simply be profit making, right? And enriching, corporations and already wealthy people. It's going to be like, what benefits are these things having along all of these different registers? What harms are they going to create? How is that all traded off? And so for Indigenous peoples to be a part of something like free, prior, and informed consent, it means taking seriously the type of values in a very substantive way that we're bringing to bear to think through these very complex issues, right? So, I think just in closing, the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action also have a very similar effect. When people read them from a public leadership standpoint, you shouldn't read them as directives. You should read them as tools to think with, right? And so when you go read them, it's not like they mean one thing. You have to be able to then take them up and be like, this is what they mean to me, and this is how I think they can apply in this situation. Of course, that's a scary prospect for many people, but especially for non-Indigenous peoples who then are put in the driver's seat of like, I have to be responsible for thinking through what decolonization is in a very substantive way. And I have to develop my own thoughts because I won't always just be able to rely on an Indigenous person to tell me what to think and to do. And also, that's not a relationship either, right? Like it has to be both sides building up their capacity for these intersocietal norms. But of course, as I suggested before, Indigenous peoples have already made multiple suggestions around what those intersocietal norms should look like. So, really, these are some of these thoughts I have towards this idea of like, okay, really at the end of the day, it's about public leadership and decolonization. It's really about the capacity of individuals working with groups of people to be able to translate their understandings of decolonization into action, right? And it's it's not just the developing of these thoughts, but the ability to then translate it into outcomes. And of course, that is the very tricky part of doing all of this work. So I hope that was a good talk for everyone. And yes, thanks for having me. And I was happy to come and speak with everyone today.